On a bitterly cold morning, as the world rushed past without a second thought, something fragile and forgotten lay trembling inside a battered cardboard box, left to perish, abandoned by those who should have cared. But God was not done writing his story. A man, simply going about his work, heard a faint cry, a sound that would change both of their lives forever. And years later, when he needed it most, that small act of kindness returned in the most unbelievable way. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from today. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who needs a reminder of God's love. The sky was a dull shade of grey, heavy with thick clouds that threatened snowfall. The frigid morning air bit at exposed skin, turning breath into visible mist. It was just another winter morning in the city, a morning where life hurried on, indifferent to those left behind. David Reynolds, a sanitation truck driver in his late 50s, sighed as he pulled his thick gloves tighter over his calloused hands. It had been years since he stopped expecting surprises on the job. Collecting trash day after day, in neighborhoods both wealthy and forgotten, he had seen it all. Broken furniture, discarded dreams, things once cherished and now abandoned. But today, something would be different. As his truck rumbled into the vast landfill on the outskirts of town, the familiar scent of rotting waste and damp cardboard filled the air. The ground beneath his boots was slick with melting snow, mingled with filth and remnants of things no one wanted anymore. He maneuvered his truck into position, preparing to unload another heap of discarded remains from the city's endless cycle of consumption. Then he heard it, a sound so soft, so fragile, that at first he thought he had imagined it, a faint whimper, barely audible above the groan of machinery and the distant cawing of scavenger birds circling overhead. He froze, his heart giving an uneasy lurch. Years on this job had made him numb to the things people threw away, but there was something about that sound, a plea, a desperation, that cut through the cold morning air. David turned off the engine, the sudden silence making the whimper even clearer. His boots crunched against the frozen ground as he followed the sound, weaving through mounds of discarded furniture, broken electronics, and torn bags of household waste. Then he saw it. A battered, damp cardboard box, half collapsed under the weight of surrounding trash. It looked no different from the countless others that littered the dump, yet from within its fragile walls came the unmistakable sound of something still clinging to life. Cautiously, David crouched down and peeled back the torn flap of the box. What he saw inside made his chest tighten. A tiny golden retriever puppy, barely more than a few weeks old, lay curled in the corner. Its golden fur was matted with grime, its frail body trembling uncontrollably from the bitter cold. Wide, terrified brown eyes met his, pleading without words. David exhaled sharply. He had seen a lot in his lifetime, but this was different. Someone had left this puppy here to die. His gloved hand hovered for a moment before he reached inside. The puppy flinched, but it was too weak to resist. When his fingers brushed against its fur, he felt the sharp ridges of ribs beneath, a clear sign of hunger, of neglect. "Easy there, buddy," David murmured, his voice rough yet strangely gentle. "I gotcha." Carefully, he lifted the puppy out of the box, cradling it against his chest. The poor thing shivered violently, its tiny body barely generating enough warmth to keep it alive. A wave of anger and sadness churned inside him. He had seen broken things before, but this wasn't just another discarded object. This was a living, breathing soul. Someone had made the cruel decision to toss this puppy aside, leaving it to freeze or be crushed beneath the weight of the next garbage load. David glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching from the distance, some heartless figure who had abandoned the little creature. But there was no one. Just the vast expanse of the landfill, an endless graveyard of things that had outlived their usefulness. The puppy let out a weak whimper, pressing its tiny nose against his coat as if searching for warmth. David sighed. He knew he had no business taking in a dog. His life was simple: wake up before dawn, work until his back ached, return to an empty house, and do it all again the next day. He wasn't a young man anymore, and taking care of a pet was a commitment he wasn't sure he could handle. But he also knew one thing for certain: he couldn't leave this little one here. With a decisive nod to himself, David adjusted his grip on the shivering pup and made his way back to the truck. He pulled open the passenger side door and carefully placed the puppy on the seat, wrapping it in an old flannel jacket he kept for cold mornings. "Guess you're coming with me, kid," he muttered, shaking his head. The puppy blinked up at him, its tiny body still trembling, but its eyes filled with something new: hope. David climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and turned up the heat. As the warmth spread through the cabin, the little pup nestled deeper into the jacket, letting out a soft sigh of exhaustion. David stole another glance at the fragile creature beside him and felt something stir deep inside, a feeling he hadn't known in years. He had spent his whole life hauling away things people no longer wanted, but today, for the first time in a long while, he had found something worth keeping, and maybe, just maybe, that was no accident. David's small house sat on the edge of town, tucked between rows of aging buildings that had seen better days. It wasn't much, but it was home, quiet, predictable, and until recently, completely his own. That changed the moment he carried the trembling puppy through his front door. After the freezing ordeal at the landfill, David had immediately set about warming up the fragile creature. He filled a shallow bowl with warm milk, unsure if it was the right thing to give a pup so small, but to his relief, the little thing lapped it up eagerly, though its weak body trembled with each sip. Next came a gentle bath. David hesitated before turning on the sink faucet, wondering if the pup would be too weak to handle the water, but the grime caking its fur left him little choice. He worked quickly, keeping the water lukewarm and his touch careful. The filth melted away to reveal soft golden fur beneath. "That's better, huh?" he muttered as he wrapped the puppy in an old towel, rubbing him dry. The puppy, now visibly more comfortable, let out a small yawn, curling up into the warmth of the fabric. It was the first sign that he trusted David, and for some reason, that stirred something deep inside the old man. He knew he couldn't just keep calling him kid. "Max," he said after a moment, trying the name out loud. It fit somehow, strong but simple. The puppy blinked up at him, tail giving a slight wag as if accepting the name as his own. For the first time in years, David felt a shift in his routine. His mornings weren't just about gulping down coffee and heading to work before the sun rose. Now he had a tiny shadow following his every step, padding after him on clumsy paws, whining for attention, or curling up at his feet when exhaustion took over. And David, despite himself, found he didn't mind. He told himself it was temporary, that he was just helping the pup get back on his feet. But when Max started wagging his tail every time David walked in the door, when the once frail pup started bounding around his tiny backyard with reckless joy, David felt something he hadn't in a long time. He wasn't alone anymore. Max had turned his small, quiet house into something more than just a place to sleep. But reality had a way of creeping back in. A decision that couldn't be avoided. One evening, after another long day at work, David sat at his kitchen table, staring at Max as the pup gnawed on an old slipper. The thought had been in the back of his mind since the day he brought him home, but now it loomed over him. Could he really keep Max forever? David was old. He worked long hours. He didn't have family around, and if something happened to him, what would become of Max? The pup deserved more than just a man who wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up. David sighed, running a tired hand down his face. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, after making a few calls, he found a reputable animal shelter in town. They assured him they had experience with abandoned puppies and would find Max a loving home. It should have been a relief. It was the logical thing to do. But as he looked at Max, who sat by his feet staring up with complete trust, David felt an ache in his chest that no logic could explain. Still, He made his choice. The following afternoon, with a heavy heart, David loaded Max into his truck. The pup, unaware of what was happening, wagged his tail, happy to be going for a ride. David didn't speak as they drove to the shelter. His hands tightened around the wheel. This was for the best. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. The drive to the shelter felt longer than it should have. David gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, his knuckles white against the worn leather. The hum of the truck's engine filled the silence, but it did nothing to drown out the thoughts swirling in his mind. Beside him, Max sat on the passenger seat, his small body curled up on the same flannel jacket David had wrapped him in the day they met. The pup's golden fur gleamed in the weak winter sunlight, filtering through the windshield. David didn't glance over at him. He couldn't. If he did, he might not be able to go through with this. Memories that never faded. As he drove through the familiar streets, his mind drifted, not to the present, but to the past. Once, long ago, he had driven these same roads with someone beside him, someone who had filled the silence with laughter, who had reached across the seat to squeeze his hand when the world felt too heavy. Claire. Her name came unbidden, like a ghost whispering in the back of his mind. It had been years since she was taken from him, but grief had a way of lingering, settling into the bones like a cold that never quite left. Some days, he convinced himself he had learned to live with it. Other days, like today, he wasn't so sure. His life had become an endless routine. Wake up, work, come home, sleep, repeat. There was no laughter in his house anymore. No warmth waiting for him when he walked through the door. The bed on the other side of the room had been empty for years, the space beside him colder than any winter morning, and for the longest time he had told himself that this was just how it was now. But then Max had come along. A house no longer empty. The pup had been in his home for only a short time, but already things had changed. There was noise now, the sound of small paws skittering across the floor, the soft rustling of a wagging tail against furniture, the occasional excited bark when Max chased his own shadow. There was movement, the way Max followed him everywhere, padding after him when he made coffee, curling up by his feet whenever he sat in his old recliner. There was company, a presence in the house that made the silence a little less unbearable. But David had fought against it. He told himself not to get attached, not to let the dog become something more than a temporary guest. Because deep down, he knew how these things ended. He had lost before. He would lose again. Better to let go now before it became too hard. That was why he was doing this. That was why, despite the hollowness in his chest, he kept driving toward the shelter. A goodbye that didn't feel right. When they arrived, David parked the truck but didn't immediately step out. His fingers drummed against the wheel, his jaw clenched tight. Max, still curled up in the seat, lifted his head and gave a small, sleepy wag of his tail. He didn't know. He didn't understand. David swallowed hard and forced himself to move. He climbed out, walked around to the passenger side, and carefully lifted Max into his arms. The pup nuzzled against him, completely trusting, completely unaware that the man he trusted most was about to leave him behind. The shelter was a small building with a faded sign, the kind of place run by people who meant well but were always overworked. The woman at the front desk greeted him kindly, unaware of the war raging inside him. "You're bringing in a stray?" she asked, already pulling out a clipboard. David hesitated. The words stuck in his throat. He looked down at Max, who looked up at him with big, round eyes. He had meant to say yes, but all that came out was, "His name is Max." The woman smiled, writing the name down. "That's a good name. We'll make sure he finds a great home." A great home, a better home. That's what David wanted, wasn't it? He placed Max on the floor, and the pup immediately sat at his feet, tail wagging, completely content just to be near him. David took a step back. Max didn't follow. Instead, the pup just sat there, ears slightly drooping, watching him as if he already knew what was happening. David clenched his fists. "Sir?" the woman prompted. He cleared his throat, nodded stiffly, turned around, and walked out the door. A house empty again. The drive home was silent. The flannel jacket still lay on the passenger seat, but this time it was empty. When he stepped inside his house, the quiet hit him like a blow to the chest. No little paws clicking against the floor, no warm body curling up at his feet, no bright eyes watching his every move, just silence. David sat heavily in his chair, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? But as he stared at the empty space beside him, the space where Max should have been, he wasn't so sure. The breaking point. That night, David barely slept. He tossed and turned, the house too still, too quiet. He kept expecting to hear the soft rustle of fur shifting in the corner, the faint jingle of a tiny collar, but there was nothing. At dawn, unable to ignore the gnawing ache in his chest, he made his decision. He grabbed his keys and jacket, barely stopping to lace his boots before heading back to his truck. The drive to the shelter felt even longer than before, his fingers tapping restlessly against the steering wheel. What if Max had already been taken? What if he was gone? The thought made something twist painfully inside him. When he pulled into the shelter's parking lot, his heart pounded. He pushed open the door, scanning the rows of cages, filled with hopeful eyes and wagging tails. And then he saw him. Max sat huddled in the farthest corner of his kennel, his small frame curled into itself. His tail no longer wagged. His bright eyes, so full of life just yesterday, were dull, staring blankly at the cold floor. Something inside David broke. He stepped forward, gripping the bars, his throat tight. "Max!" At the sound of his voice, the puppy slowly lifted his head. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but it wasn't the joyful spark that had once greeted him. It was a look of resignation, a look that said he had already given up. David didn't hesitate. "I'm taking him home." The shelter worker blinked in surprise. "You just surrendered him yesterday." "I know," David said, voice firm. "I made a mistake." Minutes later, the paperwork was signed, the kennel door opened, and Max was in his arms once more. The moment David pulled him close, he felt the tiniest sigh of relief against his chest. When they stepped outside, Max lifted his head, licking David's chin once, his tail giving a hesitant wag. David let out a rough chuckle, rubbing behind the pup's ears. Yeah, he muttered. "I missed you too, kid." And as he carried Max back to the truck, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't making that mistake again. The years had passed quietly, each season settling into the next, weaving a routine that David and Max had come to know by heart. The old man had never imagined himself forming such an attachment, but Max had become more than just a dog. He was family. They had their rituals. Every morning, David would pour himself a cup of coffee while Max waited patiently at his feet, ears perked, tail thumping against the floor. They went for long walks around the block, David grumbling about the cold, while Max bounded happily through the snow, leaving behind tiny paw prints in the frost. In the evenings, David would settle into his worn-out recliner, Max curling up beside him with his head resting against the old man's knee. Some nights, David found himself talking, to Max, to the empty house, to the ghost of Claire who still lingered in the quiet corners of his mind. For the first time in a long while, David wasn't alone, but fate had a way of creeping in when least expected. The bitter cold. That night, winter had tightened its grip on the town. The wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling window panes and piling fresh snow against doorsteps. David sat in his recliner, a thick blanket draped over his lap. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Max lay curled up on the rug nearby, his fur warm and golden under the firelight. The old man took a sip of his coffee, exhaling slowly. He should have gone to bed an hour ago, but something nagged at him. He frowned, listening. The pipes. Somewhere outside, beneath the layers of ice and frost, the old water pipes were groaning, a low, uneven sound that sent a flicker of concern through him. David sighed, setting his cup down with a soft clink. He knew he shouldn't be out in this weather, Not at his age, not with the wind cutting through the air like a blade. But the last thing he needed was a frozen pipe bursting in the middle of the night. Max lifted his head as David pushed himself up from the chair, his joints protesting the movement. "Relax, kid," he muttered, ruffling the dog's fur as he reached for his coat. "I'll be back in a minute." Max whined, his tail giving a nervous flick. David chuckled. "I'll be fine." Famous last words. The moment everything changed. The cold was harsher than he had expected. The wind bit at his face, the snow beneath his boots crunching with each step as he made his way to the side of the house. The sky above was black, the streetlights casting a dim, yellow glow across the frozen landscape. David crouched near the foundation, rubbing his hands together for warmth before pulling out his flashlight. The pipes looked frosted over, but not completely frozen. Not yet, anyway. If he could just adjust the insulation, he might be able to prevent them from bursting. He reached out, fingers stiff with cold and pain. A sharp, searing pain shot through his chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. It was as if a fist had clenched around his heart, squeezing until every muscle locked, every nerve screamed. David sucked in a ragged gasp. The flashlight slipped from his grip, landing in the snow with a dull thud. His knees buckled, the world tilted, and then darkness. A desperate cry in the night. Inside the house, Max's ears perked up. Something was wrong. The cold wind howled against the windows, but Max didn't hear his owner's footsteps returning. Didn't hear the door creak open, didn't hear the usual grumble of "damn weather," followed by David stomping the snow from his boots. Only silence. Then a faint muffled sound. Max was on his feet in an instant, his body tense. He ran to the door, ears straining, nose pressed against the wood. Then he smelled it, the sharp, unmistakable scent of David mixed with something else. Something wrong. Without hesitation, Max began to bark. Not his usual playful bark. This was different, urgent, desperate. A cry for help. The bitter wind howled through the trees, swirling fresh snow across the frozen ground. The world was silent, too silent, except for the frantic barking of a desperate dog. Max's paws pounded against the icy ground as he bolted through the yard, his breath coming in quick, panicked huffs. His instincts screamed at him. Something was terribly wrong. David was out there, somewhere in the snow, and he wasn't moving. But Max was just a dog. He couldn't call for help. He couldn't open doors. He couldn't do anything except run, so that's exactly what he did. A desperate search for help. The wind was merciless, whipping through his golden fur, stinging his nose and eyes, but Max didn't stop. He knew where to go. David's closest neighbor, Helen Carter, lived just a few houses down. Max had seen David talk to her on occasion, exchanging quick greetings over the fence. He didn't know much about her, except that she sometimes brought David fresh-baked bread and always had a kind smile. But right now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was getting to her before it was too late. Pounding on the door. Max skidded to a halt at Helen's front door, his claws scraping against the wooden porch. He jumped up, pressing his paws against the door, barking with everything he had. Bang, 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 and his claws raked against the doorframe, his tail stiff, his ears pinned back. His whole body shook with urgency. But nothing happened. No lights turned on, no footsteps, no one was coming. Max let out a sharp, frustrated whine, then threw himself against the door again, harder, louder, more desperate. Bang, bang, bang. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, there was a shuffle inside. A light flicked on. The door creaked open just enough for a frail, elderly woman to peek out. "Max?" Helen's tired voice was laced with confusion. "What on earth?" But then she saw his face, his wild, frantic eyes, the way his fur bristled with urgency, the way he kept turning, looking back toward David's house. Helen's breath caught. Something was wrong. Following Max through the snow. "David?" she whispered, but of course Max couldn't answer. Instead, he whined loudly, then turned and took off into the snow. Helen didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, slipping it over her nightgown, and rushed after him, her heart pounding. She could barely keep up. Max tore through the snow like a bullet, his paws kicking up white powder, his focus locked straight ahead. Helen, struggling against the wind, followed as quickly as she could, and then she saw him. A dark shape half buried in the snow, lying motionless. Helen gasped. "Oh, Lord!" She stumbled forward, dropping to her knees beside David's still form. His face was pale, his lips tinged blue, his breath so faint she had to lean in to even hear it. "David! David, can you hear me?" Her voice shook with fear, but there was no response. For a terrifying moment she thought she was too late. But then his eyelids fluttered. A small, weak sound escaped his lips. Hope surged through her. She scrambled for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed for help. 911. What's your emergency? "It's my neighbor!" Helen cried. "He collapsed in the snow. I think he's having a heart attack. He's barely breathing. Please, hurry!" The dispatcher's voice was calm, but urgent. "Help is on the way. Stay with him and try to keep him warm." Helen barely heard the instructions. Her focus was on David. She tore off her coat and laid it over his chest, trying to shield him from the cold. Then she looked at Max, who had never left his side. The dog had curled himself against David's body, pressing close, his warm fur acting as a shield against the deadly chill. His head rested against the old man's arm, his eyes locked onto his face, as if begging him to wake up. Helen's throat tightened. This dog had saved his life. Sirens in the night. The sound of approaching sirens pierced the frozen silence. Red and blue lights flashed against the snow, reflecting off the icicles hanging from the roof. Paramedics rushed forward, lifting David onto a stretcher. One of them checked his pulse, then turned to Helen. "He's alive," he said, "but barely. If he'd been out here much longer—" He didn't have to finish. Helen's eyes filled with tears. She turned to Max, who was still standing beside the stretcher, his tail low, his eyes never leaving David. One of the paramedics crouched down, giving the dog a small, knowing smile. "This little guy's a hero." Helen reached down and stroked Max's head. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, he is." And as the ambulance doors closed and the sirens wailed once more, Max jumped into the passenger seat of Helen's car. He wasn't going home until David did. The days that followed were long and quiet. David was in the hospital recovering from the heart attack that nearly took his life. He wasn't awake long enough to hold conversations, and even when he was, the doctors insisted he rest as much as possible. Machines beeped softly around him, and the sterile white walls felt nothing like home. But home was waiting for him. Max was waiting for him. Back at David's house, the golden retriever paced near the front door every evening, ears twitching at the sound of passing cars, tail lowering each time the door remained closed. Helen, still shaken by the night she found David in the snow, had taken it upon herself to care for Max. She made sure he had food and fresh water, stopping by twice a day to sit with him for a while. But Max didn't want food. He barely wanted water. All he wanted was for David to walk through that door again. Every evening, Max would curl up on the old flannel jacket David had left on the couch, the same one the man had wrapped around him the day they met. He would press his nose against it, inhale deeply, and sigh, waiting, always waiting. A dark presence in the night. The neighborhood was quiet that night, the air still, the cold lingering in the air, even as spring threatened to take over winter's reign. Max had just settled into his usual spot near Helen's couch, his eyes growing heavy with sleep, when his ears perked up. Something was off. The golden retriever lifted his head, nose twitching. His body went rigid, his fur bristling. A sound, a faint shuffling coming from outside. Max's sharp instincts kicked in immediately. He pushed himself up, his ears standing alert, his muscles tensing. Through the dim light, filtering in from the street lamp, he saw a shadow move near Helen's front window, a figure moving slowly, deliberately. Someone was outside. and they weren't supposed to be. The intruder. Max growled low in his throat, a deep, primal sound that sent vibrations through his chest. His tail went stiff, his stance shifting into something defensive, ready. Then, a soft click. The back door. Someone was trying to get inside. Max's growl deepened. His lips curled back, exposing sharp, white teeth. His instincts screamed danger, and he was ready to protect. The door creaked open an inch, then two. Then, Max launched himself forward. With a ferocious bark, he lunged toward the shadowy figure, his body a blur of golden fur and raw determination. His paws skidded against the hardwood floor as he charged toward the door, his bark ringing through the silent night like an alarm bell. The intruder froze. For a split second, all Max saw was wide, startled eyes caught in the dim glow of the streetlight. Then panic. The man stumbled backward, his hands flailing as Max's furious snarls echoed through the yard. He turned on his heel, sprinting back into the darkness, his shoes crunching against the frozen grass. Max didn't stop barking until the sound of retreating footsteps faded completely. Only then did he stand still, chest heaving, ears pricked toward the empty night. He had done it. He had chased the danger away. The aftermath. The barking had woken Helen. She rushed into the living room, clutching her robe around her shoulders, her eyes wild with alarm. "Max!" she called. "What's going on?" Max turned to her, his tail still raised, his ears flicking toward the back door. Helen followed his gaze, then gasped. The door was ajar. Helen's hands shook as she stepped forward, slowly pushing it closed. She flicked on the outside light, scanning the yard for movement. Nothing. But the footprints in the snow told her everything she needed to know. Someone had been there. Someone had tried to break in, and Max had stopped them. She turned back toward the golden retriever, her breath still unsteady. He was standing tall, eyes sharp, his entire body still vibrating with tension. Then, as if sensing that the danger had passed, Max relaxed, his tail giving a single, soft wag. Helen slowly sank into a chair, pressing a hand over her racing heart. "Good boy," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Oh, Max, you just saved my life." Max stepped forward and rested his head gently against her lap, letting out a small, tired sigh. Helen wiped away a tear. She had known Max was special, but now she knew he was so much more. A quiet hero. The police arrived soon after, called by Helen as soon as she could steady her hands enough to dial. They confirmed what she already knew: a break-in attempt. The intruder was gone, but Max had stopped whatever could have happened next. The officers gave Max a few pats on the head, calling him a hero. One of them even said, "Wish we had more dogs like this on the force." Helen just smiled, her heart still pounding from the reality of what had just happened. And yet, all Max did was sit quietly at her feet, his tail giving a soft thump against the floor. He didn't care about being called a hero. He had only done what David had once done for him. He had protected someone who needed him. He had saved a life, and he would do it again. The seasons changed, as they always did. Winter loosened its grip, and the icy streets melted into flowing gutters. Buds formed on the branches, soft green peeking through the frost-bitten landscape. Birds returned to the sky, filling the air with morning songs, and the world seemed to breathe again. And so did David. His recovery had been slow, painful, frustratingly slow, but he had made it. Thanks to Max, thanks to his best friend. Walking side by side again. The first day David was strong enough to walk outside, Max was ecstatic. The golden retriever bounded around the yard, tail wagging wildly, his entire body radiating pure, unfiltered joy. To him, it had been too long since he and David had walked together, and he wasn't going to let him forget it. All right, David chuckled, adjusting his jacket. "Calm down, kid. I'm not running a marathon here." Max didn't calm down. He practically danced in circles, his paws kicking up soft tufts of earth, his excitement contagious. David shook his head, but he couldn't help but smile. It felt good to be outside again. The fresh air, the warm sun, the weight of Max's leash in his hand. It was a life he almost lost, but one he had been given back. Because of Max. The dog that had once been discarded like trash had become his lifeline. A familiar question. They strolled through the quiet neighborhood, the same one they had walked through hundreds of times before. But today, it felt different, because David was different. He passed by a small shop, one he used to visit back when Claire was still alive. An old friend stood outside, chatting with a few folks on the sidewalk. When he spotted David, his eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," the man said, grinning. "They finally let you out, huh?" David chuckled. "Guess they got tired of me hogging a hospital bed." The man's gaze drifted down to Max, who stood tall and proud at David's side, ears perked, tail wagging. "I heard what happened," the man said, nodding toward the retriever. "That dog of yours, he saved your life." David looked at Max. The golden retriever met his gaze, his warm brown eyes filled with an understanding that went beyond words. And in that moment, David knew the truth. He looked back at his friend, a slow smile forming. "No one saved anyone," he said simply, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ear. "We saved each other." The life they were meant to have. From that day forward, David and Max were inseparable. They took their morning walks again just like they always had. David no longer came home to an empty house, no longer woke up to silence. Max was always there, his golden fur a comforting presence, his tail wagging at the first sign of daylight. And David? David laughed more. He grumbled less. He lived. And when he sat in his recliner at night, Max curled up beside him, head resting on his knee, David would reach down, stroke his fur and whisper, "Thank you, kid." Not because Max had saved his life, but because Max had given him a reason to keep living it. Life often throws us into storms we never saw coming, making us feel abandoned, lost, or forgotten. But God's grace moves in ways we cannot always see. His miracles often come not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, faithful presence of those he places in our lives. Sometimes it's in the form of a stranger's kindness, sometimes it's in the loyalty of a friend, and sometimes it's in the unwavering love of a dog who refuses to give up on us. David thought he was saving Max when he pulled him from the trash that cold morning. But in the years that followed, Max became more than just a rescued dog. He became the very hands of God's grace. Twice, when David needed him the most, Max was there. A reminder that no one is ever truly alone. A reminder that love, loyalty, and faith can be found in the most unexpected places. So treasure those who walk into your life, whether they have 2 legs or 4. Because one day, when you least expect it, they might be the very miracle God sends to save you. May God bless those with kind hearts, and may the loyalty of a good dog always light the way. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that love and faithfulness still exist in this world.